Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started here. There's still a few more people joining, but I'd like to thank each and every one of you for attending a series of 3 speakers today. This is the second one of our 3. My name is Mariah Smith, and I work for Farm Food Care on Prince Edward Island. For those of you who are not familiar with Farm Food Care, we have 3 different provincial groups in Canada. There's one in Saskatchewan, one in Ontario, and there's one in PEI. Our collective vision is to connect consumers to truthful information about food and how that food is grown. If you're interested in learning more, visit our websites via farmfoodcare.org or canadianfoodfocus.org. Feel free to sign up for our newsletter too. We keep everything up to date on what's happening. We would also like to thank our partners for making this winter series possible. Canola Eat Well and the Agri Competitiveness Program, which is under the Canadian Agriculture Partnership. The intent around the winter speaker series is to continue the conversation about food. We all know how important food is. Our third speaker, which is happening April 22nd, Scott McDermott of Gordon Food Services, will be discussing restaurant trends. And David Hughes' presentation, which was on February 24th, can be viewed from our website if you missed it. With respect to today's presentation, I'd like to ask everyone to keep their videos and microphones off. And if you have any questions at all to our presenter, just post them in the chat. It's on your Zoom there. It's just a functionality. It's called chat, so just give a click there. At the end of our presentation, we're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions that will be moderated by Kelly, and she's from Farm Food Care Ontario. She's the executive director there. Right now, I'd like to introduce Lynn Weaver with Canola Eat to introduce our today's speaker. Lynn Weaver is a registered dietitian, professional home economics, and a self-proclaimed food lover. As part of the Canola Eat Well team, her passion is to inspire you to get into the kitchen and use healthy ingredients and connect you to the 43,000 farmers that grow canola in Canada. Canola Eat Well is a joint partnership between Alberta Canola Producers Commission, Manitoba Canola Growers, and Saskatchewan Canola Development Commission. Here you go, Lynn.
Thank you so much. As mentioned, our second speaker in this series is Jo-Ann McArthur. Jo-Ann has spent a career building brands and consumers and retailers at Molson, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, and Cadillac Fairview, and is a founding partner and president of Nourish Food Marketing. Jo-Ann now builds powerful brands for food and beverage products in Canada, the US, and Europe, creating marketing strategies that help move products off the shelves into the consumer shopping baskets, onto their plates, and into their hearts. She has worked with entrepreneurs to launch award-winning products and with municipal, provincial, and federal agencies to help create programs that support Canada's food industry. Please welcome Jo-Ann McArthur.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm just going to share my screen now, and I'm looking forward to lots of good questions because there's certainly no end of controversy here. So food labeling, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's get into it. First, a little bit about Nourish for those who don't know about us. I like to say we know a lot about a little. We strictly work with food and beverage across the entire food ecosystem, whether you're a producer, processor, manufacturer, retailer, association, food service. We run the whole gamut, but don't ask us to do anything other than food and beverage because we can't help you. But in terms of our service, we do everything that a normal marketing advertising agency would. The only thing is we also have a test kitchen and chefs and lots of yummy smells in the office. And again, everybody here is a food specialist. So our package designers strictly work on food. And because we're specialists, I like to say we're in sort of a unique position working across the entire food ecosystem. We can connect dots that others may not be able to see. We do a lot of our own research. We do a lot of research We have a lot of syndicated databases. We also do a lot of research on behalf of our clients. And so when we step back, we're able to connect those dots and where we think the food system is going. And so I think about 6 years ago, we started with our first trend report. You certainly, I'll give you a link and you can find past years, but we've got a pretty good record because of that. We came out with our 2021 in November of last year, and I'll take you through a few of them that I think are applicable to you at the end of the labeling discussion. And I just want to say, when we talk about these trends, we're not making value statements. Again, we work across all kinds of brands and products, but we're just trying to say what we're seeing from both the ag side as well as the consumer side. And we like to think that part of our job is to bridge that gap. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get going. But first, why do those pesky consumer preconceptions and perceptions actually matter? We actually talked about, I think it was in our 2018 trend report, we talked about a trend called radical transparency. And I think at that time, ag wasn't quite ready for it. They weren't ready to pull back the veil that was between consumers, who really don't have much of a clue about what goes on with the food system, and on the other side of the curtain. But of course, with COVID, that veil really fell. So for the first time in history, consumers, or in consumers' lifetimes anyway, they actually saw empty shelves for a period of a few weeks. They didn't really understand that there were two different distribution systems, whether it was food service or grocery. And so, you know, while the food system bent, it didn't break, it really caused consumers to start thinking about things that they'd never thought about before. And so what happened was the food system became front page news. Meat processing became front page news. Consumers never really thought of how things got from a farm onto their plate. And now they were starting, you can see Google's trend data at the bottom, they started Googling terms like food system, supply chain, meat packing, things that you never saw happen in the past. And so there was a greater interest, they were building knowledge, and they wanted to know more about those things that were in their carts. And so we started to see more conversations and things that we call made matters, how different inputs all along the way, including the workers and the animals, were actually treated. And that goes all the way to the environment. And we know from CCFI, their excellent research, that, you know, consumers trust farmers. They're one of the most trusted people in society, but they don't necessarily trust farming. And I know you're probably sick of Buttergate, but I wanted to talk about this because I think it's a great parable for what I'm talking about, trying to bridge that ag and consumer gap. And, you know, there's two sides to every story. And this is one place where we have to consider both sides. And so, you know, it's about not just animal science and productivity, but also about consumer confidence in the food system. And, you know, certainly our relationship with butter has changed. It changed over the past decades. It used to be fats were bad, now fats are good. But it certainly has changed over the lockdown period with COVID. We're spending more time, we're at home, we're eating breakfast at home and we didn't normally. And so, you know, you can see the tweet at the top that launched all of this. And it was a food writer named Julie who thought her butter seemed harder than it normally had. So she sent a tweet out asking if others had also seen this as well. And that's where things started to fall apart, because even though dairy farmers spent lots of money on research, they didn't actually research things like butter. Nobody knew whether, you know, is it a function of the weather? Is it a function of people just being home more and maybe noticing things they didn't notice before? But the problem was nobody knew, and they should have. Butter hardness probably is something that you should be measuring over time. And the other issue was, you know, if you look at who butter's competition is, it's plant-based spreads. And so to stop, over time, there's been a movement from dairy to plant-based, and partly for environmental reasons. And so consumers, when they heard the words palm oil, they were not, they thought clear cutting, right? In Indonesia and places like that. Palm oil is a hot button for a number of consumers. Again, though, because not a lot of research was being done with consumers, industry wasn't prepared for that. And so when consumers heard palmitic acid, they had a certain reaction. And unfortunately, the industry wasn't prepared. And there's a good news story there. If you look at the palmitic acid that's fed to cows, it's actually a byproduct of palm oil. So cows are actually upcycling waste. So there were good messages. A lot of farmers that I've talked to, the palmitic acid they use comes from sustainable sources. But again, they weren't prepared. There had been no crisis training. There were no key messages developed to really go in and talk about that. And so, my plea here is to think about not just, is it okay for farm productivity? You also have to go that next step and say, and how will consumers perceive this so that you're prepared once this comes out? And of course, we know how this has gotten blown up out of proportion in some ways. It's been on the BBC, it was on Jimmy Fallon late night. But again, just when you're doing research, make sure you're considering that end user and looking at language. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that further on as well. So who do consumers trust and why? Well, not surprising, consumers trust social media over professionals. We hear about all the misinformation that's online, but we're just wired to go out and find facts and stories that support our own personal beliefs. And of course, with the internet, you can find just about any study to support what you want. So it's easy to rationalize. And it's sad to say that celebrities actually have a larger influence on what Canadians eat than Canada Food Guide. And again, this has been proven time and time again. If you look at, again, CCFI's excellent research that they did a few years ago, they found that shared values are 3 to 5 times more powerful than facts when it comes to earning trust. And as I said, consumers were built, we've got this confirmation bias, right? And, we've got 2 systems at play. There's some excellent Nobel Prize winning research and books on this, but we are wired for emotion first and the rational part comes second. We use facts to justify. And so you need to make sure that whatever you do resonates and tells a story. And that's why you can't just ask consumers to look at the science. It's just not the way we work. And if you look at social media has been called a bigger campfire, right? We evolved as a species around that campfire to tell stories. We connect with emotion. And what social media is basically that campfire on steroids. So, there's a great quote that nothing tastes as good as food served with a good story. And that's very true. And, we've seen over the past, 10 years that science has been mocked. That's Trump on climate change. There's lots of distrust out there. And again, those shared values, those celebrity endorsers are going to outweigh any facts. There was some research that recently came out, quite scary, that shows those who had the least understanding of science were the most science opposed, had the most science opposed views. And they also thought that they knew the most. So there's this huge disconnect. So again, we really need to move to a place of shared value and connecting with stories. And then, the facts provide that rationale afterwards. And, you know, I mentioned earlier that concept of made matters. You know, what's in my food? Where did it come from? How was it farm sourced? How were the animals? How are the people taken care of? And ultimately, how is the planet taken care of? So that's something we call made matters, and it's becoming more and more important with consumers. And again, when we think of language, it's all about how we frame. And quite often the words that we use to frame set up the entire argument. So for instance, you know, when the pro-choice people chose that term for their movement, they probably thought, though, that was a clever 2 words until they got out-framed by pro-life. And it just puts it in a different light. So always think about language and where you're going with that. And it can be just as basic as farm fresh eggs. I see that on some cartons versus large eggs. And which egg is, you know, they're all farm fresh eggs, right? But which one is going to taste better? So language is just so important. So I'm going to dive right in with GMOs because boy, is there a lot of myth going on there. And the first thing I want to talk about is something called the signaling effect. And you've all seen it, but that's when a consumer or a shopper receives an implicit message from an explicit cue. So for instance, if I'm shopping in the soup aisle and I see something that says low sodium soup, my brain automatically says, oh, sodium must be bad. And that's part of the problem with GMOs. Now that we've got GMO labeling, you know, say non-GMOs, it automatically says to the consumer, oh, GMOs must be bad, even though they don't even know oftentimes what GMO stands for. And, you know, we're seeing bans in all sorts of countries, even though the science and agencies have said these foods are safe. The book that I have there, some of you may have seen it, Mark Linus. He was one of the original GM field records. He went in the middle of the night and he would go in and undercover and he would destroy the fields where the experimentation was going with GMO farms. And he has changed his mind since. He's written this book. And it's interesting because what he says, where industry got it wrong with GMOs was actually the choice of the first use case. And I'm going to talk about this later because that first use case is very, very important because again, it's going to frame the whole thing for consumers. And so Monsanto had sound commercial reasons, no doubt, for first use, you know, being a pesticide dependent GM crop. But there was huge risk there, right? And if they'd thought about the consumer lens, they may have chosen their first use case a little more carefully. So if they'd used it with farmers in poor countries with drought tolerant crops, and then they could talk about, you know, saving lives, feeding more people on the planet, that would have certainly changed the conversation we're having around GMOs. And there's this huge disconnect, right? Science and facts are not going to win the argument with consumers. That's not the way we're wired. So even though you've got 90% of scientists saying GMOs are safe, 90% of consumers say they aren't. Now, if I look at a better first use case, you may have seen these Arctic granny apples. So they are out of the US. And what they've done is they've turned off that enzyme that makes apples brown when cut. And so their first use case is sliced apples. And, you know, it's positioned as less food waste, longer shelf life, healthy snack with kids. So perhaps that's a better way of positioning it. We'll see how that does. You know, and the question as we move further with CRISPR technology, will consumers, again, be able to differentiate the difference between gene editing versus gene modification? So again, hopefully, you know, when we're seeing CRISPR being used with vaccines and there's respect there, but, you know, that first use case is going to be really, really important. Gluten-free water, who knew? But did you know that you actually have to label it thus in Brazil? Kind of crazy. And, you know, we've seen a huge rise in consumers saying they need to be gluten-free. Now, obviously, you know, if you're celiac, absolutely, but that's about 1% of the conversation. If you talk to consumers, there's a huge bunch of them that feel that they have wheat sensitivities, partly because of this wheat belly book. And the first thing that consumers do when they are doing an elimination diet is they get rid of wheat. And I've heard consumers talk about brain fog. But the other thing we all hear about is when consumers go to Italy, they come back and they rave about, you know, how they ate all this pasta and pizza and bread, and they had no issues at all. It was great. Well, you know, little did they know that a lot of what they were eating over there actually was Canadian wheat. But it was just, they were moving around. There's just this perception, right? And so we've seen over the lockdown period with COVID that consumers are indulging a little bit more in carbs. Carbs are becoming a little more acceptable because, you know, we need some indulgence in our life. But, you know, it's gotten a little out of control. So now I always show Little Potato Company. They got so many emails and calls from consumers asking if their potatoes were gluten-free. They actually put the label on when they redid their packaging, and guess what? Sales went up. And, you know, oats, as long as they're in a gluten-free facility, are gluten-free. And if one calls it out, then everybody has to call it out. Another myth we saw, this whole hormone-free. And I know that A&W is a huge lightning rod often with ag for reasons. You know, they saw a marketing tactic that they leveraged, frankly. We all know that, you know, hormones have been banned in Canada since the 60s, but consumers didn't know that. And they had a belief that, you know, there were possibly hormones. And so A&W leveraged that initially. So again, you don't want to assume. You know, we've even seen with milk studies there where consumers don't know that, you know, all of most of their dairy products are local. That's the way the system works. We all know that. Consumers didn't know that. So actually calling out where your milk from is important, especially now that we're starting to see some imports from the US. So again, I just ask that you apply that consumer lens, because you may not be getting credit for things that you're already doing with consumers. This is one that's starting to bubble up a little bit, glyphosate. And this is not a term I would have expected to hear outside of industry, but I am starting to see it and hear it. And so if you look at this product here by 1 Degree, it's organic. So because it's an organic product, it's already likely that their wheat and oats were produced without pesticides. But they've gone one step further. And again, it's that signaling and to say that, you know, they've moved beyond the organic certification and they're actually glyphosate free. And we know that, you know, again, glyphosate is acceptable by Health Canada, by the US EPA, and Europe as well. But we're starting to see an increase in foods that are labeled glyphosate free. And again, it's a small base, but it's up 58% versus the previous year. So small compared to where non-GMO is, but it's starting to bubble up. And I was actually doing some focus group research 3 weeks ago, and it came up in groups, unprompted. So just want to make sure that that's starting to get on your radar as well. And so what does meaningful transparency really mean for your food business? You know, we know that blockchain is an opportunity to perhaps for consumers to follow things all the way through, but how far can you pull that curtain that I talked about between you and ag? How far back can you pull it? How far in can you invite consumers? It's one thing to say something on a website, but we know that images are so much more powerful than words. So, you know, what kind of storytelling can you do with pictures, with videos? Again, consumers want to know more, and by inviting them in, that's the best way to build trust. And so the way forward, I believe, is more transparency. And of course, you know, you're going to need to balance that off, because I put these two visuals here because we know consumers have a very idyllic view of what farming is. And, you know, in the words of Mike von Maslow, he says, there's nothing natural about agriculture. And that's true, right? You know, you're in it, you need to make money, you need high yields. But I think that there needs to be, we need to have the right consumer language, tell the right stories, and do a little bit of education with consumers so they see things from both sides. This is one of my favorite examples of actually inviting consumers in. So this is a bunch of potato farmers in Ireland. And they've actually added value, and they have created their own line of potato chips. And what they do is on the back of that package, there's something called the Spud Nav. So you can go online in the website, you can type in that code, and it will instantly take you to the field where the potato that's in your potato chips were grown. So do you think that that bag of potato chips is going to taste fresher, tastier than the Lay's beside you? Absolutely. And we know that younger generations are even more visual. They're very much, you know, show versus tell. So anytime you can go that step further in terms of inviting consumers in, remembering that, you know, less than 10% of consumers have actually ever been on a working farm. We know that giving consumers more information is very, very powerful. There's lots of third-party audited certifications out there as well, which also helps combat some of the fake news that I talked about, and gives more, you know, it's often better to have a third party verifying things. But again, you want to get credit for what you're already doing with consumers. And, you know, that goes all the way to, you know, videos, if possible, showing worker conditions and animal conditions as well. And why is that important? Well, you know, it's not just, you know, you who's looking at it, it's also the retailers. And, you know, there's nothing like the power of the purchase order to change things. So they listen to consumers. They're also trying to get an edge. So you're starting to see, you know, Walmart really push sustainability. Costco, there's a supplier code of conduct that has to be signed. Farm Boy, they're all really pushing the envelope here. And as a producer, you have to know that they're going to be trying to go as quickly as the consumer is in order to gain market share as well. And we've seen that local increasingly is mattering, especially during, it was growing before the pandemic, and it has continued to take off even more. And again, local is a proxy, I think, for transparency and trust. And we know that consumers, you know, if something's locally grown, they see it as better tasting, it's fresher, it's more nutritious, and also it's supporting community. We like to support our neighbors. So all those things mean better taste in the consumer's mind. I had to put that Ontario made logo in there because I think it's just the worst looking thing for food, frankly, but it's important to call it out. We've seen a real rise in food nationalism over the last few years, but especially as as our worlds have gotten smaller during the lockdown period, and we're staying closer and closer to a home. And, you know, we saw the rise of victory gardens last summer. It was hard to get anything gardening because everybody wanted to work outside in their garden. So consumers have a new appreciation for what fresh and local can taste like. They also have a new appreciation for just how hard that is, how hard it is to grow food as well. But we've seen a rise in CSA boxes in a lot of places. It's hard to actually find one you can sign up for. We've seen an increase in direct to consumer relationships with producers as well. And we expect that those things are going to continue. And we know 4 in 5 Canadians claim that they're actually willing to pay more for local. And again, local is a very elastic term. In our research, we've seen, if you're in Toronto, Vancouver is seen as more local than Buffalo. So, there seems to be a hard stop at that border, but local can be as small as my community, my province, and it can go as far as as all of Canada. And I think part of that is trust. Brand Canada has a great, brand when it comes to food. And there's also been a lot of food safety recalls from things coming from south of the border, with onions and peaches and romaine as well. And so, we've also seen lots of discussions around food security and wanting to make sure that things are grown locally. Well, how do you do that in Canada year round? Well, we've seen a huge amount of money going into greenhouses and vertical farming. The good news is that Canadians perceive those crops to be as good as those grown conventionally. 63% say they're the same quality, and 27% actually say that they taste better. And we know, one of the advantages is you can get from farm to shelf in, less than a day. So that's a huge advantage to stuff coming up versus stuff coming up from California. And, close to home, we've seen Local Leaf, we've seen Good Leaf Farms. And if you look at Quebec, there's even a supermarket, Avril Supermarché Santé. They actually have a vertical farm on their roof. Talk about hyper local, when you can bring those two things together, really, really powerful. We've seen a real increase in what I'm going to call mindful eating trends during COVID. And this is some US IRA data, which is similar to our Nielsen data. And they show that the top 3 categories in terms of growth within food and beverage over the past year is first, product origin. So that's all about local and, artisan. Second is societal care. That's about, B Corps, eco-friendly, fair trade. And the third is those lifestyle diets, whether it's keto, plant-based. So we're seeing the importance of local. That was also highlighted in a most recent FCC survey as well, where 58% of Canadians said they're more likely to buy Canadian grown or made food. So Canadian is of difference that sells as long as you highlight it and promote it. We also think that plant-based could be at a tipping point. We've heard huge growth percentages, but it's really a small base. If you look at, in terms of the total protein, plant-based is still only about 2%, but there are mainstream awareness now with consumers of plant-based products. They've got broad distribution. They're sold throughout quick serve restaurants, which is often a place where trends get going. And the prices now are coming down and are close to achieving parity. So we think it's at a possible inflection point. And if you look at past, there has been big changes in our diet. At one point, we used to eat this much beef and this much chicken, and that amount has actually flipped. So we believe that we're at a tipping point with plant-based as well. I want to highlight a couple of trends from our this year's trend report, and then we'll open it up for questions. And one of the things that I thought was of interest was this whole concept of values-based eating. And certainly, during the lockdown period, there has been a whole refocus by society on our values. You've seen the rise of Black Lives Matter, discussions of systemic racism, and I mentioned egg being front page, and that has also gone to our migrant laborers as well as our workers in meat processing plants. And that's an ad at the top that was in some mainstream magazines. you know, as part of a union drive, but we're expecting to see more union drives, worker protection on both sides of the border as this discussion really starts to gain more momentum. And, you know, you've all heard of fair trade and that designation, and that's largely for goods that are grown outside of North America. We are starting to see the logo on the left, Food Justice Certified, starting to pop up. And that's all about worker conditions within North America. So we're starting to see in the US some products with that certification. So could that be the new fair trade for goods within North America? As part of that, we're seeing a real rise in what's called conscious capitalism. And this isn't just a hippie term. It's actually practiced by Starbucks, by Whole Foods, by Trader Joe's. And what it is it says that stakeholders that don't have a voice need to be represented at the boardroom table. So the environment, the workers. And you know, this is getting mainstream support in business publications, Harvard Business Review, Ford Magazine, all sorts of articles being written on this. So, you know, it's time, if you are a company, to perhaps relook your company values and your corporate social responsibility policies, because we do believe that, you know, conscious capitalism, B Corps, companies with purpose, and values that consumers can buy into are going to be growing. Ethics-based eating. Certainly in our 2020 trend report, we wrote about environmental impact-based eating. And, you know, you fast forward a year and you're seeing it really start to mainstream. So Chipotle, they actually let consumers calculate their environmental footprint of their order. So you can choose between menu items. Panera Bread, another national chain, they actually have half of their entrees now labeled as cool food meals. They've worked with the World Resources Institute and have calculated what a person's daily carbon footprint should be, similar to, you know, the number of calories you're supposed to consume in a day. And they've labeled products that way. And what they've calculated is we need a 38% reduction in the way we eat in terms of carbon footprint. And so again, we're seeing a refocus on the environment and the planet, and an understanding that the way we're currently eating does not seem to be sustainable. So we're starting to move from just plant-based to planet-based as well. We're also seeing more discussions around soil health in terms of climate change and regenerative agriculture, conversations going beyond just farmers. And certainly within agriculture, conversations are moving from just soil productivity to soil profitability. But soil is really becoming the hero. If you're the Nobel Prize for Agriculture, World's Food Prize, was just won by a soil scientist. The top trending documentary last year on Netflix was called Kiss the Ground. And it was all about soil as the hero and regenerative agriculture. So of course, you know, for this to really take off, farmers need to be compensated for their role in this. But we're seeing it mainstream even with consumer packaged goods. So General Mills, who owns Annie's, they've made regenerative agriculture part of their mission statement. Of course, you know, the term regenerative agriculture doesn't have one defined meaning yet, but they've defined it to have 3 pillars: soil health, above ground diversity, and farmer economic resilience. Nourish has just popped up in the US. It's an online marketplace that allows farmers to get paid for storing that carbon in the soil. So you get a token, a Nourish token, which is a blockchain-based currency, and you can trade it to companies as a way to offset their carbon footprint. So it's a bit of a win-win for everybody. And, you know, this ethics-based eating, you know, is also going to our pets as well. You know, if you look at pets, they're estimated to make up 20% of the world's meat consumption. And consumers, especially younger generations that have been adopting a lot of animals over the past year during the pandemic, they're getting concerned about their carbon paw print, so to speak. I think it's interesting, we're starting to see some blurring lines between pet and human food. So you all know Ben & Jerry's. They have just launched in the US a line of doggy desserts. They use the same ingredients as the plant-based human desserts, and they're shelved in the same freezer. So right next door. So when you treat yourself, you can also treat your pet. And we believe you're going to start to see more blurring lines. Consumers are more interested in what their pets are eating. And if you look at big companies like Nestle, General Mills, Smuckers, they all own pet food companies as well. And it also could be an opportunity for some of what I call those alternative ick proteins that consumers may not want to go towards, mealworm, insect. It may also be a place for pet food, because we know certainly a number of dogs have meat allergies, beef allergies as well. So, you know, are we going to see regenerative organic be the next organic, sort of beyond organic as well? And, you know, that's something that combines worker welfare, soil health, and just farm worker fairness. And could that be the next evolution in organic? And again, you know, are you getting credit for things that you're already doing? You know, farmers have been caretakers of the land for a long time, but if you're not telling consumers about it, you're not going to get credit for it. And, you know, often what's best about us, we take for granted. So sometimes you need to get a second opinion and talk about these things that you're already doing as a way of future-proofing as well. So I know I covered a lot in 45 minutes, and I'm going to open it up to questions, but I want to, you can scan that QR code. It'll take you to our most recent trend report. We've also got a white paper on our website about COVID. Our website is nourish.marketing. You can send me questions directly, link in with me. And now I'm going to open it up to questions.
All right, and we have a lot of questions coming in, Jo-Ann. First of all, hi everybody. I'm Kelly Daynard with Farm and Food Care Ontario. I don't know about you, but the last 45 minutes, I've got so many thoughts in my head. I guess I'll start with a question from me, Jo-Ann, and that is, so we've seen COVID, and pre-COVID, people were maybe more worried about labeling. And then when they saw empty store shelves, they were probably just worried about, could they find milk or could they find eggs? And do you see that continuing, or do you see us going back to the old norm, I guess?
We're never going to go back to the old norm completely. You know, there was mass trial, you know, and a real shakeup in brand loyalty because you had those empty shelves. So you're right, consumers were grabbing whatever they could. There's been a real highlight on food waste because it's in consumers' face, right? We've seen that whole share of stomachs shift. So, you know, we're arguably probably eating a few more calories than we did pre-pandemic, but we're eating more at home. And so we're seeing more of that food waste. So we're seeing consumers, that's really rising in terms of consumer issues. But, you know, we've seen a resurgence in carbs. And I think that's partly because consumers are redefining health to include mental health. And that includes, you know, carbs, sugar is, you know, certainly more acceptable. People are baking again. And I think there's this realization that whole health is part, mental health, and food, frankly, is part of that. It makes us feel good. We're seeing, I think, a bit of a move away from diet culture as well. You know, everybody's put on those COVID pounds, and I think people are more accepting of that going forward, understanding of just how important food is. Yeah, going forward. So hopefully that answered your question.
It does, thanks. Let me just look to my screen here. So Patricia Chewy, who is a registered dietitian in Canada that many of us know, she's saying, great information, Jo-Ann. Are you saying with products like the Little Potato Company, it actually makes sense to label it gluten-free, GMO-free, etc., even if it's naturally that way, because label icons are what consumers want? Or is it more credible and builds more consumer trust to use those labels where it's logical?
Yeah, logic is a hot button word there. I think, you know, there's certainly nobody in the industry who didn't know that potatoes were gluten-free. And the problem is, as I say, when one company does it, then everybody has to kind of jump in and do it, unfortunately. And they did it because consumers were confused. Consumers didn't know in large part that potatoes were gluten-free. And so it made sense for them to do it. And certainly those logos that you talk about, they are shortcuts for consumers for things that they want to see. You've got, you know, when you go, if you think about the way you shop, there are 50,000 SKUs in a store. And yet most of us can get through a store in 30 minutes. So how do we do that? By using shortcuts. And, you know, labels, symbols that consumers automatically recognize and know can capture their attention in a couple of seconds, because, you know, especially these days, you're not able to actually pick things up and turn it around and read side labels, right?
Awesome, great. Okay, from Grace, the question is, regarding GMO products, how do you educate a consumer or potentially flip their mind to share values about it being safe?
I worry that, you know, we have passed the point of no return on GMOs. I really do think, you know, consumers are so dug in, and there was that research I referenced that said consumers who actually were the least educated thought they knew the most and were the most anti-GMO. And so I think at some point we somehow have to change the conversation, and facts are never going to win an argument. It really is not. You know, it's all about connecting with emotion, telling those stories. And so that's why I said, you know, first use cases are really important as we move forward and CRISPR technology starts to get into food as well. We really need to learn from the whole GMO fiasco, frankly. And even the word GMO, who came up with that? Like, come on. Right? Language is important. So it's one thing, you know, for us in food science to come up with a name, but how is a consumer going to catch that word? And certainly there is nothing positive sounding about genetically modified organisms. So I do worry that perhaps with GMOs, we've gone a little, you know, we've lost the fight. However, I will say there may be an opportunity with younger generations. We are certainly at a time with the vaccine where, you know, science is arguably what's going to save us and get us out of this mess. So there may be a way to build the story with younger generations, but again, don't lead with facts, because that's not going to win.
Wouldn't you like to go back 25 years and help them with their communications?
Yeah, and their first use case. Come on, think it through.
A question from Lynn Weaver. She says, I thought your comment about consumers trust farmers but not farming sometimes was very interesting. How do we get consumers to better trust the farming industry?
Invite them in. Whether it's virtually, I mean, you know, you're doing great work with your organization, right? You're having virtual farm tours. Before COVID, you were actually conducting farm tours. You know, that's what I talk about. You know, how far back can you pull that curtain and invite consumers in? I think it's really telling that, you know, the McDonald's of the world, A&Ws of the world, if you go back and looked at their advertising starting about a decade ago, most of their advertising wasn't about the end product. It was about the farmers, right? The beef farmers, the egg farmers, you know, and putting a human face on that as a way of raising the quality of their products. So again, we connect with people. And that's what I mean by, you know, consumers trust farming, not necessarily they trust farmers, not necessarily farming. And you've got so much negative, you know, if you want to find it, you can find it, right? I always talk about dairy is scary. If you've ever seen that video on YouTube, made by some young woman in the US, I forget how many 100 million views it's gotten. And she's just put together all sorts of different videos and snippets and it's totally misleading. Industry came up with their own video, very fact-based, and, you know, look at the number of views it has. Thousands. So again, it's, you know, invite them in, because if you don't invite them in, they'll make up their own narrative. And, you know, what's going on in their head oftentimes is a lot worse than what's happening. So, you know, consumers understand that to feed the world, you need to do it at a certain scale. And I showed those two pictures of dairy operations. You go in, you see those cows with the robotic milkers, you know, they go in when they're ready to be milked. It's, you know, I think consumers would be pleasantly surprised to see how that works versus what they have up here, which is sort of a Frankenstein concept.
100%. Okay, another question from Patricia. She wonders if you feel that if a food product is truly 100% vegan, is it better to label it vegan or better to label it plant-based? Plant-based,
absolutely. Because vegan has certain other labels attached to it, and there's lots of good research on this. You know, it used to be people who were vegan, it was based on certain beliefs and value statements, and it's moved beyond that. It's mainstream. So plant-based is far more positive than vegan.
Perfect. Okay. A question from Clinton at Farm and Food Care Saskatchewan. Do you feel the idea of conscious capitalism would actually garner consumers paying a higher price for products?
Yeah, and there's been some research on that as well. And certainly companies that practice what's called conscious capitalism, they also make higher profits. So by doing good, you can also make more money. If you look at the three companies I mentioned, you know, Whole Foods, Starbucks, Trader Joe's, they all operate in the premium side of the market. So you can absolutely charge more. And it's, again, you know, consumers enjoy food more with a story, with a positive story. They feel good, and you know, they don't mind paying too much money for that latte.
Awesome. Question from Michelle, who's a farmer in Eastern Ontario. He's wondering if you see preservatives being added to food labels.
Preservatives, not
I think
quite.
Just as an ingredient item.
Okay, and again, it depends on what you call it. So, you know, the whole citric acid, you know, I always talk about, you know, there are different terms that you can use for the same ingredient. So make sure that you are using the most consumer friendly of those different ingredient names. Because, you know, to you, you may know what it is, but to a consumer, it sounds scary. If I can't pronounce it, if it's not something that's in my pantry, you know, I'm going to be worried about it. It's not going to sound clean. It's going to sound, you know, science, and that's bad in food. So make sure you use the most consumer-friendly language. If you are using a preservative, and that's why I wanted to show the Arctic apples, make sure that you tie it to a benefit, reduced food waste.
Super. Okay, a follow-up question from Patricia. So she says, just to clarify, if it can be answered with a yes or a no, if I'm creating a new food product that is naturally gluten-free and has always been gluten-free, should I still put gluten-free and GMO-free icons on it, even if it was something like dried peaches?
And here I would say, what do consumers believe? So, you know, even ask, you know, 20 people who aren't in the industry. Just do some quick, what I call kitchen research. are all peaches gluten-free? Are all peaches non-GMO? And see what feedback you get there. And again, I hate to say it, first mover advantage. If you're the first one to label it and nobody else has, you'll probably see a bump in sales. But from an industry standpoint, I really hate to see that, because then it just, it's that negative signaling that unfortunately it would be much better if consumers just understood food a little better.
Awesome. We've got a couple more coming in here, so we'll try to fit as many in as possible. From Lynn in Ontario, you mentioned that plant-based eating was still low, about 2%. What do you mean by this being the tipping point? Which products will gain more traction as plant-based? As an example, burgers come to mind as a product that's already accepted.
Yeah, absolutely. And burgers, I would say, are sort of the first mainstream. So you've seen it, and it's interesting. Kroger in the US did a lot of research with Beyond Meat when it first came out, and they actually shelved it in 3 different places in the supermarket to see where it got the most traction. And it got the most traction in the meat bunker, right beside the hamburger. And we know that, 90%, over 90% of people who buy that product also have meat in their food basket. So it's broadening beyond just, vegan, vegetarians, people who consider themselves, that hasn't really grown a lot over the past decade. But those products are starting to mainstream. And you saw the success of Beyond Meat and A&W. And part of the success of it was they positioned it as just another hamburger. So you got the fries with it, you got the Coke with it. They weren't trying to make it some virtuous, healthier product, because frankly, it isn't, right? But their positioning is, it's got to taste, and it's got to be the same experience for consumers for them to move. And Impossible Burger actually, during the pandemic, their sales have been going up. And at the same time, they're also, even though they're having a hard time keeping up with demand, they're reducing their price. They want to be at price parity with meat proteins. And that's really going to drive adoption. And consumers are very aware of these products. Most consumers have tried them now and have had a pretty positive view of them. You read the ingredient list, it's a pretty long ingredient list, so I think there may be a reckoning there, but.
Awesome. And I think in the interest of time, we have to leave it there. I think we could probably keep this going on all afternoon, but on behalf of the group here and their virtual applause, thank you for saying yes to this. I think you've given us all a lot to think about. For the folks on the line, we will be having a draw for those who complete an evaluation survey that we'll be sending out. And please, in that, tell us what types of webinars you'd like to be hearing in the future. As a reminder, we have one more presentation coming up in this winter, now spring speaker series. So we have one on April the 22nd featuring Scott McDavid of Gordon Food Service. He'll be talking about how his company went into crisis mode at the start of COVID-19 with millions of dollars of perishable products in their warehouse and no markets for them. And then he'll talk about the rebuilding process and his predictions for food service post-COVID. A million thanks to Canola Eat Well and the Agri-Competitive Program for supporting this initiative. We at Farm and Food Care, the 3 groups, have been thrilled to be able to host you at a time where those tours that Jo-Ann was talking about earlier can't happen in person, but they are coming back. And then finally, we have a conference coming up next week that is also free to attend. This is run by Farm and Food Care Ontario. It features well-known Canadian professional home economist Marilyn Smith, who many of you know, as well as David Coletto, who is a marketing research leader and a real thought expert on millennials. Registration is free to attend again, and you just need to visit the Farm and Food Care website at the bottom of that screen to get yourself registered for that conference next Tuesday. And with that, again, Jo-Ann, thank you. And to everybody on the line, thanks for spending an hour with us, and we hope to see you next month.
Thanks all, and please link in if you've got any other questions. Happy to continue the conversation offline.
Awesome. Have a good day, everybody.